The moment everyone in my wife's family started laughing at me was the exact moment my life quietly began to change. I remember the sound of that laughter more clearly than anything else that night. It echoed across the long mahogany dining table inside my father-in-law's mansion in Charleston. Crystal glasses clinked, forks scraped against porcelain plates, and somewhere behind me someone whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear. 33 years old, and still living off his wife's family. A few people chuckled. Then someone else added, "That's what happens when a man has no future." More laughter followed. Not loud. Not cruel in the obvious sense. Just casual. Comfortable. The kind of laughter people share when they believe they're speaking the truth. I sat there quietly, staring down at the untouched steak on my plate, pretending their words didn't cut deeper than they probably realized. For 2 years I had been the family's favorite joke. The useless live-in son-in-law. The failed entrepreneur. The man who married into money but somehow managed to bring nothing with him. And everyone at that table believed one thing with absolute certainty. That I would keep my head down forever. That I would smile politely. That I would continue to endure their contempt without ever changing the story they had already written about me. But just as my brother-in-law lifted his wine glass to deliver another joke about my career, the sound of tires rolling slowly over gravel echoed from outside the mansion. A black luxury car had just pulled into the driveway. Within minutes, a stranger would walk through the front door and say something that would make the entire room fall completely silent. Because the man everyone despised that night was the one person in the room whose story none of them actually knew. The dinner had started like every other Whitmore family gathering. My father-in-law, Richard Whitmore, sat at the head of the long dining table, surrounded by relatives, business associates, and a few family friends. It was his 72nd birthday, and the celebration had been planned with the kind of polished elegance the Whitmore family always insisted on. The mansion overlooked Charleston Harbor, and through the tall windows behind the table you could see the lights of cargo ships moving slowly across the water. Whitmore Logistics owned several of the docks along that harbor. The company had made the family wealthy long before I ever entered their world. When I married Emily Whitmore 4 years earlier, I knew her family was successful. What I didn't realize was how much that success shaped the way they viewed people, especially someone like me. At the time Emily and I met, I was running a small technology startup in Atlanta. It wasn't a billion-dollar company, but it had real potential. Investors were interested. My team believed we were building something meaningful. Then the market shifted. One investor backed out. Then another. Within 6 months, the entire company collapsed. I spent every dollar I had trying to save it. But eventually, the numbers made the decision for me. By the time the company officially closed, I had lost nearly everything. Emily suggested we move temporarily to Charleston while I figured out my next steps. Her parents had more than enough space. The guest house behind the mansion sat empty most of the year. What was supposed to be a 6-month reset slowly turned into 2 years. And somewhere during those 2 years, my role inside the Whitmore family quietly changed. I wasn't just Emily's husband anymore. I became the live-in son-in-law. In their world, that title carried a certain meaning. A man who depended on his wife's family. A man who had already failed once. And perhaps most importantly, a man who clearly didn't belong in their circle. Marcus Whitmore, Emily's older brother, was the person who enjoyed reminding everyone of that fact the most. He leaned back in his chair now, swirling a glass of expensive red wine as he looked across the table at me. "So Nathan," he said casually, loud enough for everyone to hear, "any exciting career updates lately?" Several cousins smirked. I knew exactly what Marcus was doing. He asked the same question at almost every family gathering. It was never curiosity. It was entertainment. I gave the same calm answer I always gave. "I've been consulting on a few small projects." Marcus chuckled. "Consulting?" He looked around the table. "That's a polite way of saying unemployed." "Isn't it?" Laughter rippled through the room again. Even a few distant relatives joined in. My mother-in-law, Patricia Whitmore, didn't laugh. But she didn't defend me either. Instead, she set her wineglass down slowly and said, in a tone that sounded almost sympathetic, "Emily always had such potential." The table quieted slightly. Then she finished the thought. "I just wish she had chosen a husband who could keep up with her." Emily shifted beside me. I felt her hand tense beneath the table, but she stayed silent. And honestly, I didn't expect her to speak up. In the Whitmore family, conversations like this were considered normal. I had learned long ago that arguing back only made things worse. When people already believed you were weak, defending yourself simply gave them more reasons to laugh. So instead, I stayed quiet. I cut a small piece of steak and placed it on my fork. The truth was, I had grown used to these dinners, used to the subtle insults, used to the way certain relatives spoke about me like I wasn't even sitting there. But that night something felt different. I couldn't explain it at the time. Maybe it was the way my father-in-law kept glancing toward the windows. Maybe it was the strange tension in the air that had nothing to do with the jokes. Or maybe it was simply the feeling that the quiet life I had been living for the past 2 years was about to change. Marcus was halfway through another story about one of his business deals when the sound interrupted him. At first it was faint, the low rumble of an engine outside. Then the crunch of tires rolling slowly over the gravel driveway. Several people turned their heads toward the windows. Headlights swept across the front lawn. A sleek black sedan had just pulled up outside the mansion. Marcus frowned. "We're not expecting anyone else tonight." A moment later, the doorbell rang. One of the house staff walked through the foyer to answer it. From the dining room, we could hear muffled voices at the door. Then footsteps approaching down the hallway. The staff member appeared at the entrance to the dining room looking slightly confused. "There's a gentleman here asking for someone named Nathan Cole." Every head at the table turned toward me. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Well, Nathan," he said slowly, "looks like your consulting business finally has a client." A few people laughed again, but the laughter faded quickly, because the man who stepped into the dining room a few seconds later didn't look like a client. He wore a dark tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase. Another man stood behind him holding a slim folder of documents. The stranger's eyes scanned the room once before settling directly on me. Then he asked a question that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the mansion. "Are you Nathan Cole?" I stood slowly from my chair. "Yes." He studied my face carefully, as if confirming something he had been searching for. Then he said the words that would make the entire Whitmore family fall completely silent. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." The dining room went silent the moment the stranger said he had been looking for me. Not the polite silence people use when a guest enters the room. This was different. Heavier. The kind of silence that makes everyone suddenly aware that something strange is unfolding right in front of them. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me at the same time. Marcus leaned back in his chair and laughed awkwardly, trying to break the tension. "Well, this is interesting," he said, raising his glass. "Nathan, you forgot to mention you had friends in expensive suits." A few cousins chuckled, but the laughter sounded uncertain now. The stranger ignored them completely. His attention stayed fixed on me. He stepped closer to the table and placed a black leather briefcase beside the birthday cake that no one seemed interested in anymore. "My name is Daniel Hart," he said calmly. "I'm a legal investigator working with Halstead & Rowe International Law." The name didn't mean anything to me, but I noticed something strange the moment he said it. My father-in-law, Richard Whitmore, had gone completely still. Daniel Hart unclipped the briefcase and removed a thin black folder. "I apologize for interrupting your dinner," he continued, "but we have reason to believe Mr. Nathan Cole may be connected to an unresolved inheritance case." The word inheritance drifted across the table like smoke. Marcus snorted. "Inheritance," he said. "You definitely have the wrong guy." He gestured toward me with his wineglass. "This man lives in my parents' guest house." The room laughed again, though this time it felt forced. Daniel Hart didn't react. Instead, he opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table toward me. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "does this woman look familiar to you?" I picked up the photo slowly. It showed a young woman standing beside a hospital bed, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blanket. The image looked old, faded around the edges. Something about the woman's face stirred a strange feeling in my chest, like a memory trying to surface. But I couldn't place it. "I'm not sure," I said carefully. Marcus leaned across the table to look. "Let me guess," he said with a smirk. "Long-lost relative." Daniel Hart turned toward him for the first time. "No," he said calmly. "Potential mother." The words dropped into the room like a stone. Emily's hand tightened around my arm. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. I felt the same confusion. "My parents died when I was a kid," I said. "Car accident?" "That's what I've always been told." Daniel Hart nodded slightly. "Yes, that is what your official records say." He reached into the folder again and removed another document. "But those records may not be accurate." Marcus pushed his chair back loudly. "Oh, come on," he said. "This is ridiculous." My mother-in-law crossed her arms. "You can't just walk into someone's home and start making accusations about their family," she said sharply. Daniel Hart remained composed. "We are not making accusations," he replied. "We are investigating a missing heir connected to one of the largest billionaire estates in the world." The word billionaire caught everyone's attention. Marcus laughed again. "This just keeps getting better." Daniel Hart slid a document across the table toward me. "This is a hospital birth record from Savannah, Georgia," he said. I leaned forward slowly. At the top of the document was a date, 33 years ago, and beneath it, the name Nathan Cole. My stomach tightened. "That can't be right," I said quietly. "My birth certificate says I was born in Raleigh." Daniel Hart nodded. "Yes, that certificate was issued 3 months after this hospital record." The room felt colder suddenly, for the first time in years. Small memories from my childhood surfaced in my mind. Questions I had asked my aunt that she never answered clearly. Conversations she avoided. Documents she always claimed had been lost. Emily looked at me, confused. "Nathan, did you know anything about this?" "No," I said honestly. Marcus leaned over the table again. "Even if those papers were real," he said, "what does that have to do with billionaires and inheritance?" Daniel Hart closed the folder halfway. "The reason we are here tonight," he said, "is because the estate we represent belongs to Alexander Vaughn." Emily inhaled sharply. Marcus frowned. "Wait, you mean the tech founder?" Daniel Hart nodded. "The same man." One of the cousins whispered something under his breath. Alexander Vaughn had been one of the most powerful technology billionaires in the world. His companies dominated artificial intelligence, infrastructure systems, and global defense software. He had died less than a year earlier. And according to every public record, he had no children. Daniel Hart looked directly at me again. "That assumption may be incorrect," Marcus scoffed. "You're saying Nathan is secretly related to him?" Daniel Hart didn't argue. Instead, he reached into the briefcase and placed a small sealed kit on the table. "A DNA test will confirm the truth." Emily stared at the kit. "You're serious?" "Yes." Marcus laughed again, but the confidence in his voice was fading. "You actually expect us to believe this?" Daniel Hart ignored him. His eyes stayed on me. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "the decision is yours." The small plastic tube and cotton swab sat on the table between the wine glasses and plates. For most of my life, I had never questioned the story of my past. My parents died. My aunt raised me. That was it. But now the foundation of that story had cracked open. And once a crack appears, it's impossible to ignore. Marcus leaned back again. "Well," he said, "you going to play along with this fantasy?" Emily squeezed my hand. "You don't have to do anything tonight." I looked at the DNA kit. Then I looked back at Daniel Hart. "If I take this test," I asked, "how long until the results come back?" 48 hours. The room waited. Marcus smirked. "This should be good." But I wasn't thinking about him anymore. I reached for the swab. And in that moment, I realized something strange. Whether this stranger was telling the truth or not, my life had already started changing the second he walked through that door. The room stayed quiet as everyone watched me pick up the DNA swab. It was such a small thing. A thin plastic stick with a cotton tip. Something that looked harmless enough to belong in a doctor's office. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Well, this should be entertaining," he said. Emily stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Nathan, you don't have to do this tonight." But the truth was I already knew I was going to. For most of my life I had accepted the story of my past without question. My parents died in a car accident. My aunt took me in and raised me. It was tragic, but simple. Now that story suddenly felt incomplete. I looked at Daniel Hart. "If I take the test," I said. "You said the results come back in 48 hours. "Yes. And if it says there's no connection to this Vaughn family, then we close the investigation." The answer was simple enough. I nodded once and opened the testing kit. Marcus smirked. "Can't wait to see how this fantasy ends." I ignored him. Daniel explained the process briefly. It took less than a minute. I swabbed the inside of my cheek and handed the sample back to him. He sealed it inside a small container and placed it carefully into his briefcase. "That's all we need for now," he said. Marcus sighed loudly. Well, that was thrilling. But Daniel didn't leave. Instead, he remained standing beside the table, watching me for a moment before speaking again. "There are a few things you should understand while we wait for the results." My father-in-law's voice cut in immediately. "That won't be necessary." The firmness in Richard Whitmore's tone caught everyone's attention. Daniel Hart looked at him calmly. "I believe Mr. Cole deserves to know why we began searching for him. For the first time that evening." My father-in-law hesitated. Then he said nothing. Daniel took that as permission. He opened the folder again and laid several documents on the table. "The investigation into the Vaughn estate began 6 years ago," he said. Marcus frowned. "Why 6 years?" "Because that's when Alexander Vaughn quietly hired a private firm to locate his missing son." The words made several people at the table shift in their seats. Emily looked confused. "I thought Vaughn never had children." "That is the official story," Daniel replied. "But internal documents from his estate suggest otherwise." He slid another photograph across the table. This one was clearer than the first. A younger Alexander Vaughn stood in a hospital room, smiling slightly as he looked down at the baby wrapped in a blanket. Beside him stood the same woman from the earlier photograph. The photo was taken 33 years ago in Savannah, Georgia, Daniel said. Marcus leaned closer. "So what?" Daniel tapped the image gently. "This was the week Vaughn's son was born." I stared at the picture. Something about the room in the photograph felt strangely familiar. Not in a clear way, but like a faint memory hidden somewhere deep in my mind. Daniel continued. 3 days later, the child disappeared. Emily blinked. "Disappeared?" "Yes." Marcus laughed under his breath. "So a billionaire loses his kid and somehow Nathan ends up in the story." Daniel didn't respond to the sarcasm. Instead, he placed another document on the table. "This is the official report filed at the time." Marcus skimmed it quickly. "Child presumed dead." He read aloud. "Exactly," Daniel said. "But that conclusion was reached without a body." The room grew quieter again. I felt an uneasy sensation creeping into my chest. Because suddenly I remembered something from when I was 8 years old. I had been sitting at the kitchen table in my aunt's house one evening. Where was I born? I asked her. She froze for just a second. Then she said quickly, "North Carolina." But she never looked me in the eyes when she said it. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. Kids rarely question the stories adults give them. Now the memory felt different. Incomplete. I returned my attention to the table. "So you're saying the baby in that photo never died?" I said. Daniel nodded slowly. "That is what the evidence suggests." Marcus rolled his eyes. "And you think that baby is Nathan?" "We believe it is possible." Marcus laughed again, but the confidence in his voice had weakened. "This is ridiculous." Daniel slid one more document across the table. "This is where things become more complicated." Marcus glanced at it. "What is it?" "A business partnership agreement." The paper was dated more than 30 years earlier. Emily leaned forward to read it. Then she frowned. Wait, that company name? Marcus noticed it too. At the top of the document was the name of Alexander Vaughn's original technology startup. Below it was a list of early investors. One name stood out clearly: Whitmore Logistics. Marcus looked up slowly. That's our company. Daniel nodded. Yes. Marcus frowned. So what does our family business have to do with Vaughn's missing kid? Daniel spoke carefully. The partnership between Vaughn and his early investors ended abruptly the same year the child disappeared. Emily looked at her father. Dad, did you know about this? Richard Whitmore didn't answer. He simply stared at the document. The silence around the table began to feel heavier with every passing second. Daniel finally closed the folder. The DNA results will arrive in 48 hours, he said. But until then, there is something you should consider. Marcus sighed. What now? Daniel looked slowly around the room. When powerful people spend decades trying to bury a secret. His eyes briefly stopped on my father-in-law. They usually have a reason for doing so. The silence after Daniel Hart mentioned Whitmore Logistics did not last long. Marcus was the first to break it. This is getting ridiculous, he said, pushing his chair back from the table. You're trying to connect our family business to a missing billionaire heir because of a couple of old documents. His voice carried the same confidence it always did. But something underneath it sounded strained. Daniel Hart remained calm. I'm not connecting anything, he said. The records already do that. Marcus scoffed. So what? 30 years ago, our company invested in a tech startup. That's not exactly a crime. Emily turned toward her father. Dad, is it true? Richard Whitmore sat quietly at the head of the table. His expression was calm, almost unreadable. Yes, he said after a moment. Whitmore Logistics was one of several early investors. Emily frowned. You never mentioned that. There was never a reason to... Marcus leaned forward again. Exactly. It's old business history. It has nothing to do with Nathan. Daniel Hart slid another page across the table. The partnership ended the same year Vaughn's son was declared dead. Marcus rubbed his forehead. And you think that means something? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room slowly. I think it raises questions. Marcus laughed again. But fewer people joined him this time. Emily glanced at me. Nathan, are you okay? I nodded. Though I wasn't sure that was true. 2 hours earlier, I had arrived at this dinner expecting another evening of small insults and awkward smiles. Now I was sitting in the middle of a conversation involving missing heirs, billionaires, and my wife's family business. Marcus leaned back again. Let me get this straight, he said. You're suggesting my family somehow helped make a billionaire's kid disappear. I didn't say that. But you're implying it. Daniel folded his hands calmly. I'm saying the timing of certain events is unusual. My mother-in-law finally spoke. This is inappropriate. Patricia Whitmore said sharply. You have no right to walk into our home and accuse us of something like that. Daniel turned toward her politely. I'm not accusing anyone. Mrs. Whitmore. He paused briefly. I'm investigating... Marcus shook his head. Well, you're investigating the wrong people. Before Daniel could respond, Emily suddenly stood up. Enough! Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the room. Everyone turned toward her. Nathan didn't ask for any of this, she said. Marcus rolled his eyes. You're defending him now. He's my husband. Marcus smirked. Yeah. The guy who just might inherit billions of dollars if this fairy tale turns out to be true. Emily didn't respond to the sarcasm. Instead, she looked back at Daniel. What exactly happens if the DNA test confirms a connection? Daniel answered calmly. Then Mr. Cole would likely be recognized as the biological son of Alexander Vaughn. The words settled into the room slowly. Marcus crossed his arms. And then what? Then the Vaughn estate would need to review the legal structure of the inheritance. Marcus frowned. Meaning the current ownership of Vaughn Technologies could be challenged. The room went silent again. Everyone in the world knew the name Vaughn Technologies. It was one of the largest technology companies on the planet. Marcus stared at Daniel. You're saying Nathan could actually have some kind of claim to that company? If the evidence holds up? Yes. A quiet ripple of whispers spread across the table. I noticed something strange happening. 2 hours ago, most of these people had been laughing at me. Now they were looking at me differently. Not with respect, but with curiosity. And curiosity could be dangerous. Marcus noticed it too. He leaned forward again. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, pointing at Daniel. You're manipulating everyone with this story. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Why would verifying a DNA record threaten your family so much? Marcus opened his mouth to answer. But before he could say anything, my father-in-law finally spoke. That's enough. His voice was calm, but firm enough to quiet the entire table. Richard Whitmore slowly stood from his chair. I don't care what investigation you think you're conducting, he said to Daniel. But my family will not be dragged into some 30-year-old corporate dispute. Daniel studied him carefully. So you are aware of the dispute? Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly. That business partnership ended decades ago. Daniel nodded. Yes. He picked up the document from the table and tapped it gently. Shortly after the Vaughn heir disappeared. Marcus shook his head. This is insane. Daniel looked directly at him. Perhaps. Then his gaze shifted slowly back toward my father-in-law. But Alexander Vaughn cut all ties with his early investors immediately after that incident. Emily looked confused. Why? Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. We believe he suspected someone close to him had betrayed him. The word betrayal hung in the air. I glanced at Richard Whitmore. For the first time that evening, something flickered across his expression. Not anger, not irritation, something closer to worry. Daniel closed the folder slowly. The DNA results will arrive in 48 hours, he said. But regardless of those results, he paused briefly. This investigation has already uncovered several inconsistencies in the history of the Whitmore and Vaughn partnership. Marcus frowned. What inconsistencies? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room one more time. Then he said quietly, the kind that suggests someone may have worked very hard to make sure the Vaughn heir was never found. The room went silent again. And this time, when I looked at my father-in-law, he looked afraid. The mansion felt different after that night. Not louder, not quieter, just heavier. For the next 2 days, the Whitmore house carried a strange tension that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Cousins who used to joke about my career now watched me with cautious curiosity. No one mentioned the DNA test directly, but everyone was thinking about it. Marcus tried to act like nothing had changed. He spent most of the next day talking loudly about business deals and shipping contracts, as if the entire investigation had been some strange interruption that would soon disappear. But even Marcus seemed less confident, because there was one thing no one in that house could control anymore. The results. On the second afternoon after the dinner, Emily and I sat on the back porch overlooking Charleston Harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly across the water in the distance, their lights glowing against the gray evening sky. Emily wrapped her arms around herself as if the warm air had suddenly turned cold. Nathan, she said quietly, do you actually believe this could be true? I stared out toward the horizon. I don't know. My entire life I believed my parents died in a car accident. I continued. That story was simple. It made sense. Emily nodded slowly. But if the records are wrong... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Then who were they really? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. An unknown number. I answered. This is Nathan. Mr. Cole, the voice said calmly. It was Daniel Hart. The DNA results have arrived. Emily looked at me immediately. My chest tightened. When? I asked. I'm already at the Whitmore residence. 10 minutes later, the entire family was gathered in the dining room again. This time there were no birthday decorations, no wine glasses, no laughter. Just a long table and a folder sitting in front of Daniel Hart. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Well, he said. Let's hear the punchline. Daniel didn't react to the sarcasm. Instead, he opened the folder and removed a single document. The DNA sample was analyzed by 2 independent laboratories, he said. Emily reached for my hand. Marcus tapped his fingers impatiently on the table. So, Daniel Hart looked directly at me. Mr. Cole, the results confirm a 99.9% genetic match with the Vaughn family bloodline. The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Emily inhaled sharply beside me. Marcus frowned. That's impossible. Daniel calmly slid the report across the table. Marcus grabbed it and scanned the page. His expression changed immediately. The color drained from his face. Well? Patricia Whitmore asked. Marcus didn't answer. Because the report was clear. According to the test results, I was biologically related to Alexander Vaughn. A quiet wave of whispers spread across the room. Emily stared at me. Nathan. Marcus suddenly forced a laugh. Okay, fine, he said. Let's say the DNA is real. He pointed toward Daniel. That still doesn't prove Nathan is some missing heir. Daniel nodded slightly. You're correct. The tension shifted again. But it does confirm something very important. Daniel continued. What? Marcus asked. That Alexander Vaughn did in fact have a child. Marcus rubbed his temples, which everyone thought was dead. Yes. The room fell quiet again. For decades, the world believed Alexander Vaughn died without an heir. But if I was truly connected to him, that entire assumption had just collapsed. Emily looked back at Daniel. So what happens now? Daniel folded his hands on the table. That's where the situation becomes complicated. Marcus groaned. Of course it does. Daniel continued calmly. The Vaughn estate is currently held inside a legal trust. What does that mean? Emily asked. It means the assets cannot be distributed until the identity of the rightful heir is confirmed in court. Marcus crossed his arms. And you think that heir is Nathan? Daniel looked at me. Based on the DNA results, yes. The room shifted again. But Daniel wasn't finished. There is another issue. Marcus sighed loudly. Why am I not surprised? Daniel reached into the folder and removed another document. This was discovered during the estate investigation. He placed it on the table. It looked like an old government record. Emily leaned closer. What is that? Daniel spoke carefully. A falsified death certificate. Marcus frowned. For who? Daniel met my eyes. For the child of Alexander Vaughn. The words made my stomach tighten. Marcus stared at the paper. Wait, you're saying someone declared Vaughn's baby dead, even though he wasn't? Daniel finished. Emily shook her head slowly. But why would anyone do that? Daniel answered quietly. Because if the heir never existed. He paused briefly. Then control of the Vaughn fortune could remain in the hands of certain investors. Marcus frowned. What investors? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slowly, looking directly toward the far end of the table. Every person in the room followed his gaze, until all eyes landed on the same man, Richard Whitmore. My father-in-law stood beside the window, his expression perfectly calm. Daniel closed the folder slowly. Our investigation uncovered financial records from that time period, he said. Records showing that several investors gained significant control over Vaughn Technologies shortly after the heir was declared dead. Marcus frowned. And Daniel spoke carefully. One of those investors? He paused for a moment. Was Whitmore Logistics. The room went silent again. Because suddenly the question wasn't whether I was connected to the Vaughn family. The question was why someone had worked so hard to make sure the world believed that heir never existed. No one spoke after Daniel Hart mentioned Whitmore Logistics. The name hung in the air like a weight pressing down on the entire room. For the first time since the investigation began, the attention had shifted away from me and landed squarely on the Whitmore family themselves. Marcus stared at the documents on the table as if they might suddenly disappear. This is getting ridiculous, he said finally. You're connecting dots that don't belong together. Daniel Hart didn't raise his voice. The financial records speak for themselves. Marcus pushed the papers away. 30 years ago, our company invested in Vaughn's startup. That's not a crime. Daniel calmly opened another folder. No, he said. But what happened after the Vaughn heir was declared dead is what interests us. Emily frowned. What happened? Daniel spread several financial documents across the table. These records show that within 2 months of the child's reported death, several investors acquired controlling shares in Vaughn Technologies' infrastructure division. Marcus glanced at the pages, and Daniel tapped one line. Whitmore Logistics. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. Okay. Yes. Our company invested. We already established that. But before the child was declared dead, Daniel continued. Those shares legally belonged to the Vaughn estate. Emily looked confused. So if the heir was alive, the ownership structure would have been very different. Daniel said. The room grew quiet again. I looked down at the documents, trying to process what he was implying. So you're saying the investors benefited because the heir was gone? Daniel nodded slowly. That is what the timeline suggests. Marcus let out a breath. That's still not proof of anything. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and removed a thin envelope. This next document may help clarify things. He slid the envelope across the table toward me. Inside were several printed bank transfer records. The name on the receiving account made my chest tighten. Margaret Cole. My aunt. The woman who raised me. I stared at the papers. What is this? Daniel spoke carefully. These are annual financial transfers that continued for 15 years. Emily leaned closer to read. Payments. Yes. For what? She asked. Daniel answered quietly. For guardianship. The room fell silent again. Because those documents suggested something I had never imagined. My aunt hadn't simply taken me in out of kindness. Someone had been paying her. For years. Marcus leaned over the table. Who made the payments? Daniel turned the page. The sender was printed clearly at the top of the transfer record. Whitmore Logistics. Marcus froze. What the hell? Emily looked between the documents and her father. Dad, what is this? Richard Whitmore remained perfectly still beside the window. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. My heart was beating harder now. You knew, I said. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Richard Whitmore's eyes met mine. You're making assumptions, he replied calmly. I held up the documents. These payments were sent to my aunt every year. Marcus grabbed the paper and scanned it quickly. Dad, did our company actually pay someone to raise Nathan? The entire room waited. For the first time since Daniel arrived 2 days earlier, the Whitmore family was no longer questioning me. They were questioning him. Richard Whitmore finally walked toward the table. He glanced at the documents briefly. Then he looked at me. You don't understand the world you're stepping into. Nathan. Marcus frowned. What does that mean? Richard ignored him. Instead, he spoke directly to me. Alexander Vaughn was building technology that would reshape global infrastructure. He gestured slightly toward the documents. Many powerful people had an interest in making sure that company succeeded. Emily shook her head. You're not explaining anything. Richard's voice remained calm. Some decisions were made at that time that outsiders might not understand. I stared at him. You paid my aunt to hide me. His expression didn't change. You were safe. That wasn't the question. Marcus looked between us. Dad, what is he talking about? Richard Whitmore folded his hands behind his back. The past is complicated. Daniel Hart stepped forward slightly. Mr. Whitmore, are you admitting that your company arranged the guardianship of Mr. Cole? Richard looked at him coolly. I'm saying that certain arrangements were made to ensure stability. Stability for who? I asked. For the first time. His eyes hardened slightly. For everyone involved? The answer sent a chill through me, because it sounded less like an explanation, and more like justification. Daniel Hart closed the folder slowly. There is one final document we haven't discussed yet. Marcus groaned. Of course there is. Daniel removed a sealed envelope from his briefcase. This was discovered inside Alexander Vaughn's private records after his death. Emily frowned. What is it? A handwritten note. Daniel placed it gently on the table. It was written 3 days after Vaughn's son disappeared. Marcus shook his head. And what does that prove? Daniel looked directly at me. According to Vaughn's own words, he believed someone close to him was responsible. Emily looked confused. Responsible for what? Daniel answered quietly. For taking his child? The room went silent again, because suddenly this investigation wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about betrayal. Daniel pushed the envelope toward me. You should read it. My hand hesitated slightly as I picked it up. Because if Alexander Vaughn had written down the name of the person he suspected, then that name might finally explain why someone had spent 33 years making sure the world believed his son was dead. No one spoke as the envelope sat in the center of the table. 33 years of buried secrets seemed to rest inside that single piece of paper. Marcus exhaled slowly. Well, he said. Go ahead. My fingers felt strangely steady as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed slightly with age. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, like someone had written it in a moment of fear or anger. The date at the top read 33 years earlier. 3 days after the child disappeared. I began reading silently. If anything happens to me, the truth about my son must not be buried with me. The words were unmistakably personal. Alexander Vaughn hadn't written this as a legal statement. He had written it like a warning. I continued reading, feeling the weight of each sentence grow heavier. He described the moment he realized something was wrong. How certain business partners had been pressuring him to restructure control of the company. How those same partners suddenly became quiet after the child disappeared. Then I reached the final paragraph, and my breath caught in my chest. Because Vaughn had written a single name, the name of the man he believed had betrayed him. I slowly lowered the paper. The room was waiting. Marcus leaned forward. Well, I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I placed the note on the table so everyone could see it. Then I spoke quietly. Alexander Vaughn believed someone in this room was responsible for his son disappearing. Marcus frowned. What are you talking about? Emily looked at me nervously. Nathan, whose name is on that paper? Marcus grabbed the note before I could answer. He scanned it quickly. Then his expression changed. That's impossible. Emily stepped closer. What does it say? Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and looked across the room. Dad, the single word seemed to echo through the dining room. Emily froze. What? Marcus swallowed. The name on the paper? He looked down again just to be sure. Is Richard Whitmore. The room exploded with whispers. That can't be real. No way. Emily stared at her father. Dad, tell me this is wrong? Richard Whitmore stood beside the window exactly where he had been before. His expression hadn't changed. He looked at the paper for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. Alexander Vaughn was a brilliant man. Everyone waited. But brilliance does not make someone immune to paranoia. Marcus frowned. You're saying he made this up? Richard shrugged slightly. He was under enormous pressure at the time. Daniel Hart stepped forward. That explanation would be easier to accept if the financial records did not support the same timeline. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. What timeline? Daniel opened another document. The week the Vaughn heir was declared dead. He placed the paper on the table. Whitmore Logistics acquired controlling interest in the infrastructure division of Vaughn Technologies. Marcus stared at the document. Dad, is that true? Richard didn't answer, and his silence said everything. Emily looked between us, confusion and disbelief written across her face. So what does this mean? She asked quietly. Daniel spoke carefully. If Mr. Cole is confirmed in court as Alexander Vaughn's biological son. He paused. Then the original ownership structure of Vaughn Technologies must be reviewed. Marcus blinked. In English, it means Nathan may have legal claim to a significant portion of the company. The room fell silent again. Everyone knew the scale of Vaughn Technologies. It wasn't just a tech company. It was one of the largest technology empires in the world. Marcus stared at me. You're telling me the guy we've been mocking for 2 years? He shook his head slowly. Might actually own half of one of the biggest companies on Earth. Daniel didn't exaggerate. Potentially the majority share. Marcus leaned back in his chair, stunned. I could feel the shift happening in the room. 2 days earlier, I had been the joke, the useless son-in-law living in the guest house. Now the same people were looking at me like I had suddenly become the most powerful person in the room. I walked slowly toward Richard Whitmore. You paid my aunt to raise me, I said quietly. You knew who I was? Richard met my eyes. Life is more complicated than you think. Nathan. I shook my head. No. I gestured toward the documents. You didn't hide a child to protect anyone. You hid him to protect control of the company. Marcus looked between us. Dad, did you actually know about this? Richard Whitmore didn't answer. But his silence confirmed everything. For the first time since this entire situation began, I realized something strange. I had spent 2 years believing I had no power in this house. But the moment Daniel Hart walked through that door, that power had quietly shifted. Daniel spoke again. There is one final matter. Marcus groaned. What now? Daniel looked directly at me. Mr. Cole now has the legal right to decide whether to pursue the Vaughn inheritance claim. Marcus frowned. What does that mean? Daniel answered simply, It means Nathan can take control of the Vaughn estate. He paused slightly. Or choose not to. Every person in the room turned toward me. Emily. Marcus. The cousins. Even Richard Whitmore. Because they all believed the answer was obvious. Take the fortune. Take the company. Take revenge. But the decision forming in my mind was not the one any of them expected. Everyone in the room was looking at me. For the first time since I had married into the Whitmore family, no one was laughing. No one was whispering. No one was pretending I wasn't there. The dining room that had once felt like a stage for their jokes had suddenly turned into something else entirely. A courtroom. And somehow, I had become the man expected to deliver the verdict. Marcus leaned forward slowly. Well, he said, you've got the DNA test. You've got the documents. According to this investigation, you might be the missing heir to Alexander Vaughn. He gestured toward the stack of papers on the table. So what are you going to do? Emily stood beside me, her hand lightly gripping my arm. I could feel the tension in her fingers. Across the room, Richard Whitmore watched quietly. For years he had controlled everything in this house. Tonight was the first time I had seen uncertainty in his eyes. Daniel Hart spoke calmly from the other side of the table. Mr. Cole has several legal options, he said. If he chooses to pursue the inheritance claim, the Vaughn estate could reopen ownership hearings in court. Marcus frowned. And that means Daniel didn't exaggerate. It means every business agreement tied to Vaughn Technologies over the last 3 decades would be reviewed. A few cousins exchanged nervous glances. Marcus leaned back in his chair. That would destroy half the companies connected to Vaughn. Daniel nodded. It would certainly change them. Marcus looked at me again. Well, Nathan, he said. Sounds like you've got yourself one hell of a revenge opportunity. No one spoke after that. The word revenge hung in the air like smoke. 2 days earlier, they had been laughing at me. The useless son-in-law. The failed entrepreneur who lived in their guest house. Now those same people were waiting to see if I would dismantle the empire they had spent decades building. Emily spoke quietly. Nathan, what do you want to do? It was a simple question. But the truth was, I had already been thinking about it since the moment Daniel Hart said the DNA results were real. I walked slowly toward the table and gathered the documents. The DNA report. The financial records. The handwritten note from Alexander Vaughn. 33 years of buried secrets reduced to a few sheets of paper. Marcus watched me closely. If I were you, he said, I'd take everything. He leaned forward again. You could walk into court tomorrow and wipe out every company connected to Vaughn Technologies. He smiled slightly. And after the way this family treated you, I wouldn't blame you. I looked at him calmly. That's the strange thing about revenge. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What? It usually feels satisfying before you actually take it. He frowned. What does that mean? I placed the documents back on the table. You said I could pursue the inheritance claim? I said to Daniel Hart. Yes. And that could trigger a full corporate investigation. That is correct. I nodded slowly. Then I turned toward Richard Whitmore. For 33 years? I said quietly. The truth about my life was buried so certain people could keep control of a company. Richard didn't deny it. He simply watched me. You understand the consequences of reopening this case, he said. Yes. Marcus leaned forward again. So do it. I shook my head. I'm not interested in taking your company. The room froze. Marcus blinked. Wait, what? Emily looked at me in surprise. Daniel Hart studied my face carefully. You're declining the inheritance. Not exactly. I took a slow breath. I'm accepting the truth. Marcus shook his head. That makes no sense. It will? I looked down at Alexander Vaughn's handwritten note again. If he spent decades searching for his son, I doubt it was just about money. Marcus scoffed. You're walking away from billions of dollars. I smiled slightly. No. I'm just not keeping it. The room fell silent again. Daniel leaned forward. What do you mean? I want the Vaughn inheritance transferred into a foundation. Marcus stared at me. A foundation? Yes. One dedicated to exposing corporate corruption and protecting employees who get crushed by illegal business practices. No one spoke. The weight of the decision settled slowly across the room. Marcus finally laughed in disbelief. You're serious? Yes. Instead of taking revenge on us, you're giving the money away. Not giving it away. I looked at Richard Whitmore. Using it? Because the truth was simple. Money alone wouldn't change the past. But truth could change the future. Richard Whitmore remained silent. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. Emily stepped closer and took my hand. You're really doing this? Yes. She smiled softly. Then I'm with you. Marcus leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. I don't understand you. I shrugged. You don't have to. For 2 years, the Whitmore family believed they knew exactly who I was. A man with no ambition, no future, no power. They were wrong about all three. Later that night, after the investigators left and the house finally grew quiet again, I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking Charleston Harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly across the dark water, their lights reflecting against the waves. 2 days earlier, I had believed my life was simple. A failed business, a temporary stay in my in-laws' guest house, a future I needed to rebuild from scratch. Instead, I had just discovered that my entire past had been shaped by a secret buried for more than 3 decades. But the strangest part wasn't the money. It wasn't the inheritance. It was realizing something much simpler. The people who underestimate you the most are usually the ones who understand you the least. And sometimes the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one holding the truth everyone else tried to bury. If you've ever been in a situation where people judged you, underestimated you, or assumed they knew your entire story, I'd really like to hear about it. Share your experience in the comments below. Stories like this remind us that life can turn the tables in the most unexpected ways. And if you enjoy stories about revenge, family drama, hidden truths, and moments when karma finally catches up, make sure you stay here on the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.